Riches, adventure, and trade were all forces that lured the first settlers to the grand cities. This wild country was tamed by some of the toughest souls in the West. These trappers, traders, and railroad barons relied on the Red River to wind a connection from St. Paul to Winnipeg. This made the grand cities the perfect meeting and trading place in the middle United States and Canada. Join us today as we travel back in time with several historians, architects, and residents who will help us discover the significance and history of Grand Forks. We'll see clues from our downtown today that are windows into our past. Grand Forks had a humble beginning. It was described as having only one small log home covered with dirt and bark in 1870. In the late 1800s, ox carts were a common form of transportation. These carts slowly brought people from the east into the untamed west. Often, a well-organized train of ox carts could make several trips a summer from St. Paul to Grand Forks. Settling the land was feasible, but developing the land for commercial profit was next to impossible.
Initially, 1740s, I think, it was named Les Grands Fouches. So the Frenchmen were here traveling and trading in pelts and that kind of thing. Liked it because the two rivers met here so that they could be working up in northern Minnesota and come down on the Red Lake River, and they could be working south of here and come up, and everything led to Winnipeg.
And this 3rd Street that runs right up and down Grand Forks was originally the ox cart trail. It was used to haul goods up to Winnipeg by ox cart, and that's before the steamboats were even here. That's how they got all the goods shipped up to Winnipeg, was by oxen. Parts of that trail, the actual ruts of the trail, still exist up around Park River.
The ox carts had taken up the slack from about 1800 to 1850, the 1860s. And there's one behind me. It shows how they covered the plains. It took, I think, 6 weeks for a round trip, if I remember correctly, for the ox carts to get from Minneapolis, St. Paul up to Winnipeg. There's one note that I read somewhere that said they didn't oil the wheels, so you could hear the screeching of the wheels for miles. Can you imagine? You'd have been deaf by the end of the trip.
In 1858, a steamboat crew successfully maneuvered from Georgetown, Minnesota to Fort Garry, north of Winnipeg. Transportation was changing, and this led to amazing opportunities for economic growth in the grand cities. Alexander Griggs is the steamboat captain credited with founding Grand Forks. Some experts say the founding was quite by accident.
He was working, he had started a company with James Hill, and James Hill was infamous for his railroad work. And they started a company to run steamboats up the Red up to Winnipeg. And then in about 1872, we think, some of Alexander Griggs' boats froze into the river overnight. They pulled over overnight. And there are a variety of reasons why that are attributed to that. One of them is that the boys got drunk and didn't want to continue up during the night. The other one is that it just got to be late and they pulled over. At any rate, the flatboats froze in, and they were frozen in for the season. So they dismantled the flatboats, built shelters, and stayed. And in the course of that winter, Griggs decided that this would be a good place to build a city.
After Alexander Griggs' arrival, Grand Forks grew from 33 people in 1870 to more than 1,700 over the next 10 years. A statue of Grand Forks founder still stands in downtown today.
Alexander Griggs platted out the first the old town site in '72, and most of the buildings were oriented to the river, and were in fact closer to the river, many of them, than they are now. They were oriented to the river because that's where everybody came. The passengers came, the goods and services came by way of the river, and so all the buildings were oriented to the river.
Grand Forks experienced many seasonal floods, the earliest in 1882. It was a city ordinance in 1881 that all males over the age of 21 must work 2 days on street improvement. Street maintenance proved a losing battle. The old wooden street can be seen here behind this church. This pathway is a single reminder of the difficulties of settling in a remote area and being reliant upon the natural resources. Seasonal flooding would be something Grand Forks and East Grand Forks would encounter. The river was a huge asset to both cities, but it would also prove to be an unpredictable commodity. Because of difficulties in maintaining wooden roads, a new type of road was constructed called granitoid.
As more and more people got automobiles, they began to put down roads that would support horse and buggy traffic, as well as automobile traffic. And what we have as a result of that is a product called granitoid. It's a pavement that we have in the more historic parts of town.
Grand Forks is one of the only cities in the nation with original granitoids still in use today. This street is a clue to the past that many people drive every day. Change was an economic theme in historic Grand Forks. In 1880, a partner of Alexander Griggs, James J. Hill, developed a plan to again expand transportation further west. This expansion wasn't by river, but by a new innovation called the iron horse. Some settlers said it would never last, but today we know the railroad changed this city, as well as many across the country, forever. The Red River continued to be an aquatic highway, but the railroad and the river together made it possible for settlers and immigrants to work the land for profit. The railroad became a money-making opportunity for the Dakotas. Food and mercantile could now be quickly shipped across the plains. Two rail lines, Great Northern and the Northern Pacific, helped encourage culture, diversity, and growth. Next to the railroad depots, hotels and retail stores thrived. Grand Forks was designed so people could come from the railroad directly to a variety of hotels, all located within one block.
The town really grew up around the two depots. The second railroad, the Northern Pacific, came later and built the depot over by our building on the north end of 3rd Street. And so the entire town grew up around those two depots.
One Grand Forks man had this to say about the culture in the city in 1898.
Grand Forks was a town of surprising contrasts. A hustling pioneer city of 5,000 people, it nevertheless possessed a unique air of sophistication. Here met and mingled the culture from three important sources. There were the professors from the university, the skilled workmen and professional men from the high-born and aristocratic classes of Scandinavia, and young men from the best families in the East, all here to make their fortune. Most of these men had brought their wives with them, and here was a society, youthful, ambitious, educated, cultured.
Well, our first pioneers, when Captain Griggs came and made the land claim for what is downtown Grand Forks, a lot of pioneers like him came from southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. Many of them were Civil War veterans coming west and taking advantage of the Homestead Act, which passed in 1862. And so as our first farmers started coming west, they were from more of the eastern United States and in eastern Canada. And then later on, immigrants started coming in more. The railroad did a lot to recruit immigrants from Europe, particularly, in Germany.
Up until 1920, there were so many Swedish people living in Grand Forks and North Dakota that this newspaper, which was printed entirely in Swedish, had the #1 circulation of any newspaper in North Dakota. And it wasn't even printed in English. So there were that many people in North Dakota that were Scandinavian that could read that. And that's where they printed that newspaper out of that building.
People would get together in their parlors with the fiddle and the banjo and things like that and perform for themselves. They didn't have radios, they didn't have television, and so there was both. There was the higher type of culture where they would get together and play more pieces like Mozart and things like that, and then still there was room for the ethnic culture as well, the folk songs that the immigrants brought from Europe with them. And so it was sort of a blend here.
One building that arrived shortly after the railroad was the Metropolitan Opera House in 1890. Some referred to the building as the finest opera house west of the Mississippi. For the next 30 years, it would be the social hub of the city. One resident from Grand Forks wrote about the opera house in a letter to her family back east.
It was a beautiful 5-story building, entirely up to date, and probably did as such as anything to raise the prestige of the city and further its social prestige and atmosphere. Here the city could entertain distinguished visitors, hold elegant banquets and balls, and encourage the very best of theatrical talent to stop over for night's performance in the beautiful new Metropolitan Theater.
Back in 1889, there were a group of 29 men who wanted to build something in Grand Forks that would bring people to town. And they envisioned Grand Forks to become as big as Minneapolis. And what every town, big, large town, had then to attract people to the town was an opera house. And so that's what they thought Grand Forks needed. Now, these 29 investors put up $100,000, and this opera house, the building behind me, was built in 1890, and it opened November 2nd, 1890. If you look at the building, you can see that it is very eloquently designed, and it probably was the most beautiful theater ever built in North Dakota.
It's right off the railroad track so that they could bring the entertainers and all the props and the stage sets could come right off the train, right into the opera house. And that was their Alair Center of the time.
It had a dome ceiling, and it had a marvelous stage where the curtain went up and not parted, and it had all the accoutrements of a theater in New York. In fact, the first manager when this house opened was William Broadhurst, who went on to be manager of a theater in Minneapolis and then began to write plays, and there is a theater on Broadway in New York named after him, the Broadhurst Theater.
The Grand Cities have their history represented every day by these silent monuments to the past. Architect Lonnie Lafine describes the significance of the railroad, roads, and how the logging industry affected our cities.
Well, if you know our history, the way we were kind of founded by the Canadians coming down from the north and the logging industry that came over from Minnesota, really no connection to what we are today. We're very much a United States city, but when we were originally built, we were almost purely here for the sole purpose of building Winnipeg.
But no visit would be complete to downtown Grand Forks without a walk across the river to nearby East Grand Forks. One landmark that has been in this community for years is Whitey's Wonder Bar Cafe. It's one of the oldest restaurants in the Grand Cities. Stories and scenes from the past are kept alive here. Each part has a meaning in history as well as for our future.
Whitey Larson was the founder of this business, and he opened a little bootleg place called the Coney Island back in 1925. And in 1933, when or in the late 20s, then he moved on to Demers Avenue and called it Whitey's Wonder Bar. And in 1933, when Prohibition was repealed, he built the horseshoe part of it. Yeah. So it's been the Horseshoe Bar, just as you see it today, since that time, since 1933. And it's an interesting this whole business with East Grand Forks is interesting because North Dakota was historically dry. They were dry until 1933, and all the saloons were over here, and it was solid saloons at East Grand Forks. Whitey's is the only one of those old saloons that's still here.
The downtown today continues to stir up memories of the past. These buildings are history lessons waiting to be told. The Grand Cities has a colorful background. The eclectic mix of immigrants, traders, and pioneers created a diverse culture, which is evident in the architecture that survives. Our founders cared about what their buildings told future generations. One woman wrote in early 1887 what she was surprised most about in Grand Forks.
The Gotzian block is considered the center of business. Here was, among others, a very fine store called China Hall. It was stocked with imported Haviland and Limoges, were the finest quality, exquisite dinner sets, decorated game and fish sets, even Worcester bullion wafer thins, after-dinner coffee cups, equal to anything in the Twin Cities.
It's like that Victorian period, the 1880s, when Grand Forks was no longer the rough frontier community. It was becoming more genteel. Our businessmen and their wives were setting up different societies, a lot of intellectual societies. Musical clubs, the Thursday Music Club came about in this time period. And our early pioneers who came from the East wanted to recreate organizations and social clubs that they had experienced and enjoyed in the cities where they came from before.
One consistent theme in all of these buildings is the dedication residents have to both cities. Their commitment to quality shows through these structures, even weathering events like seasonal floods and brutal blizzards. The Grand Cities have so many hidden details in downtown architecture. These details tell about the people who changed the cities from a wild prairie into a sophisticated home. Even though the people of the past are gone, their hopes and ideals live on in the heart of the cities today.
I think there's a tremendous amount of detailing downtown that we don't notice offhand. I mean, as you drive down, you understand that for the most part these are old buildings. And I think most people feel that they're attractive old buildings. But when you're walking, if you take a walking tour of downtown, you see a tremendous amount of detail.
The downtown was a bustling place into the late 1970s before more shopping centers opened on the south side of town.
At least 30 years ago, downtown was the most important part of Grand Forks, and all the businesses were downtown. And there were no malls and no South Washington, and so everybody came downtown. So on any given day, you would find lots of people shopping downtown, and all the famous stores were here. And that changed, of course, in 1951 when the highway was moved out of the city and along Washington Street.
Some of the remaining merchants tried to keep retail business viable in downtown Grand Forks. They enclosed the businesses on South 3rd Street from Demers to Kitson to make it more like a mall, but the plan never really worked. Then in 1997, the worst flood in the city's history threatened to finish off what was left of the decaying downtown. And if that wasn't enough, fire broke out at the height of the flood and destroyed 11 buildings in a 3-block area. But thanks to the help of federal, state, and local leaders, downtown saw the chance for new life.
There was a silver lining to the flood, and it is our downtown. The flood allowed us to rebuild and kickstart what inevitably would have happened anyway. The downtowns all over the country are coming back as people discover that the sort of closeness of buildings, the pedestrian-friendly, the architecture, all come to create an area that's very unique to sort of what's now traditional suburbia in all of our towns.
I do think that the flood was a turning point for downtown. Good and bad things came out of it, but I think primarily good. None of us would want to go through the flood again, but strictly for the sake of the buildings downtown and perhaps the future of downtown, miracles came from the flood in the form of federal money.
Grand Forks today is much different from the boom town of the past, but the downtown maintains the heartbeat of the community. It offers an architectural and cultural charm that cannot be replaced by modern buildings or construction. And this has helped draw people back downtown, where they can see the past, observe the present, and remind us in the future of the spirit that is Grand Forks.
There's a mentality or a thought process in North Dakota that we're so new that we don't maybe have anything worth preserving. But, you know, there are two sides to that, at least. One of them being my thought that we do have things worth preserving. And secondly, what you don't preserve doesn't get to be 200 years old. I mean, if it's 75 years old and it's not worth preserving, how is it ever going to get to be 200 years old and worth preserving? Stuff on the East Coast and the West Coast and in Europe didn't get old just because people didn't bother to tear it down. It's because they treasured it. And I think we've come to treasure it, too, here. I think we've come to value it and see that it's very hard to build a future with no past.